Gravel screamed under a crippled wheel on a lonely mountain pass, and the stranger who stopped that afternoon would change her life forever, though neither of them yet knew it. One iron rim had cracked at dawn and never stopped grinding since, a hard metallic complaint that carried far in the thin mountain air, and the mule pulling against it stumbled with every third step, its flanks dark with lather, its head hanging low under a sun that had turned the whole afternoon into something merciless. Beside it, a young widow walked with one hand pressed to the small of her back and the other resting low over the curve of her belly, and she did not see what was watching her from above. High on the rimrock, where the pines thinned into broken granite, a rifle barrel caught the sun for half a second and then was gone. She was 24 years old and 8 months carrying, and her name was Winona, and she had sold nearly everything she owned to reach this pass. The wagon wheel had cracked just after sunrise, somewhere past the last trading post, and she had spent the whole of the morning coaxing the mule forward inch by inch, stopping every quarter-mile to press cool water to her own throat and tell herself the valley was closer than it felt. Her late husband Charlie had died the winter before of a fever that took him in 11 days, so fast that she had barely finished sewing the blankets she meant to wrap their child in, before she was sewing black cloth for mourning instead. In the trunk lashed behind her seat she carried the one thing he had left her that mattered, a land claim on a river valley 2 days farther west, fertile ground he had walked and marked with his own hands, and written home about in a letter she had read so many times. The folds had gone soft as cloth, the ink at the creases nearly worn to nothing. She had told herself the mountains would let her pass, that grief had already taken its share from her, and the road owed her an easy stretch in return. The mountains, it seemed, kept a different accounting. Her black hair, unbraided now and heavy with trail dust, hung loose past her shoulders, and her doeskin traveling dress, sewn by her mother's hands before she ever left the reservation agency, was stiff with 2 weeks of sweat and sun and the fine red powder that clung to everything on this trail. Her arms ached from the reins. Her feet, wrapped in moccasins, gone thin at the sole, had long since stopped feeling the sharp stones underfoot. And still, something in her, older than the exhaustion, kept turning her eyes toward the ridgeline without her quite understanding why. Her grandmother had taught her to listen to silence, the way other people listen to sound, to notice the particular hush that settled over a canyon before something in it moved, and this silence, thick, waiting, deliberate, had teeth hidden inside it that she could not yet name. She thought of the child moving low and slow beneath her ribs and pressed her palm flatter against the curve of her belly, murmuring low in her own language, a small unconscious habit she had carried since the first months of carrying him, words that were not quite prayer and not quite lullaby. Just the sound of a mother promising a child that she was still there, still walking, still trying. Before we go on with this one, if stories about frontier courage and the men and women who wouldn't look away from someone in trouble mean something to you, take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It costs nothing, and it's the only reason we get to keep telling these stories. The wagon that rolled out from the tree line behind her belonged to a man most of the northern Rockies knew only by reputation. His name was Gideon Marsh, 41 years old, built broad through the shoulders, from 2 decades of hard country, with a face the weather had carved into something permanent and quiet, deep lines fanning out from eyes that missed very little and said even less. He hauled freight and supplies to ranches too far flung for regular delivery, trapped through the long winters when the passes closed behind him for months at a stretch, and broke wild horses in the spring for men who paid him in coin or in silence, whichever he preferred that season. His timber cabin stood alone above a place folks called Eagle Ridge, a single window lit most evenings by nothing grander than a tallow candle and the low bank fire. He kept through the cold months, and he had lived there long enough that the mountain had stopped feeling like a hiding place. His horse, a rangy bay gelding called Cole, had carried him through blizzards and river crossings that would have killed a lesser animal, and the two of them moved together, the way partners do after years of trusting each other with their lives, a shift of weight in the saddle, a lowered head, and each of them already knew what the other intended before it happened. Some folks in the settlement said Gideon had scouted for the cavalry once, before something happened that made him walk away from soldiering for good, something in a canyon far south of here that he had never once described to another living soul. Others said he'd buried a wife and a small son somewhere back east, and had come west simply to outrun the shape of two graves he couldn't stand to look at any longer. He never confirmed either story, and he never denied one either, because a man who talks about his past invites questions about his present, and Gideon had built a life that asked nothing of anyone and gave nothing away in return. But every sheriff between the Montana line and the Wyoming border knew one true thing about him, repeated so often it had become a kind of local proverb. Gideon Marsh had never once ridden past a person in trouble, not in 20 years, not one single time, not even when it cost him. That afternoon it very nearly cost him more than he knew. He saw the broken wheel first, from a quarter-mile off, the wagon's crooked lean giving it away before he could make out the woman walking beside it. Then he saw the tracks, 4 sets of fresh-shod hooves cutting sideways across the slope above the trail, pressed deep enough that they'd been made within the hour, the kind of tracks that belonged to men who had ridden up and then stopped and stayed, watching rather than passing through. He saw the hawks turning slow, lazy circles over a stretch of rock where no carrion should have drawn them yet, patient birds that had learned, the way scavengers learn, to follow trouble before it happened rather than after. And he saw the woman's face when he drew close enough to read it clearly, pale under its sunburned jaw, set tight with the effort of holding steady, eyes flicking toward the ridge and away again in the particular rhythm of someone who already suspected what was up there and was trying with everything left in her not to look like she suspected it. He did not ask questions. He swung down from his seat before the wagon had fully stopped, walked straight to her mule, and began working the traces loose with hands that moved fast and sure, the kind of economy of motion that comes only from having done a thing 1,000 times before under worse conditions than this one. "We're changing wagons," he said, not as a request, his voice pitched low and even, the voice of a man giving an order gently enough that it didn't sound like one. "Yours is done. Climb up into mine and stay low." 4 words of explanation was all he gave her, that the mountains had gone too quiet, and it was enough. She had spent a lifetime reading the difference between a man who wanted something from her and a man who simply saw a problem and moved to fix it without waiting to be thanked for it, and this was plainly the second kind, plain as the calluses on his hands. She let him lift the trunk with her husband's letter inside it into the bed of his freight wagon, watching him handle it with more care than the weight of it strictly demanded. She let him tie her exhausted mule behind his own team, saw him check the animal's legs with a quick practiced hand before he did it, as though even a stranger's tired mule deserved that much attention. She climbed up onto the bench beside him with one hand pressed instinctively over her unborn child, feeling the wood still warm from the sun under her palms, and she did not look back at the wagon she was leaving broken and empty on the trail behind them. Something told her she would not need to. The mountains had gone silent in the particular way mountains go silent, right before violence, a hush that pressed against the ears like a held breath, and Gideon had spent too many years listening to that exact silence to mistake it for peace, even for a moment. The first shot came from above and cracked through the pine branches like something tearing the sky itself in half. Then the trail behind them exploded into splinters as the abandoned wagon took a volley meant for people who were no longer standing beside it, wood and canvas bursting apart in a spray that scattered across the road, and 4 riders broke from behind a shoulder of granite with rifles already leveled, believing they had cornered 2 more easy travelers on a lonely stretch of road with nothing to slow them down. Their leader rode a black gelding and wore a long dark coat despite the summer heat, and even at a distance Winona could see the pale scar that ran from his jawline to his ear, a mark that looked like it had been given by a very sharp knife in a very close fight, and had never healed quite right. His name, though she would not learn it until later that same evening, was Virgil Cain, and he had spent 3 years turning this stretch of the Rockies into a country where fear traveled faster than any rider could carry it. Gideon did not slow down. He cracked the reins hard against the backs of his team and hauled the wagon off the main trail into a gap in the rock so narrow it looked, to Winona's eyes, like the mountain simply swallowing them whole, the light dimming as the walls rose close on either side. Bullets chewed the tailgate behind her, splitting wood and ragged white gashes inches from where her trunk sat lashed down. She wrapped both arms around her belly and pressed herself as low against the bench as her body would allow, feeling every jolt of the wheels travel up through the boards and into her spine, tasting dust thick enough to coat the back of her throat, and beside them matching stride for stride without needing a single word of direction. Cole ran loose and unafraid, an animal that had learned to read his rider's intentions the way other horses only ever learned to read a bridle. The canyon Gideon had chosen narrowed further with every 100 yards, until the walls rose close enough on either side to graze the wagon's wheel hubs, sparks striking off stone in the half-dark of the shadowed passage, and Winona understood, in the strange clear way the mind sometimes works under fear, that he had known this place existed before today, that he had ridden it and mapped it and filed it away in memory against a day exactly like this one. He hauled the team to a stop beneath an overhang where enormous dead timber lay piled and half-rotted from some long-ago flood, logs stacked against each other in a way that looked accidental to anyone but a man who had studied this exact spot with an eye toward exactly this purpose. He drew his rifle, sighted once along the trunk that bore the most weight, breathed out slow, the way a careful shot always requires, and fired. The mountainside answered with a sound like the sky itself breaking apart. Timber and boulders came down in a roaring wall of dust that filled a narrow canyon from wall to wall, a collapse so total that for a long moment Winona could not tell the difference between the falling rock and the pounding of her own heart against her ribs. Behind that wall, Virgil Cain and his riders pulled up hard against a barrier of stone and broken pine that would take them the better part of a day to clear on foot, let alone on horseback. It bought time. It did not buy safety, and Gideon knew it as well as anyone alive on that mountain. But a few hours of daylight between them and 4 armed men was worth more, in that moment, than any amount of gold on a trail like this one. They came down out of the high pass as the light was turning gold and long across the pines, and found the town of Red Pine Crossing crouched in a bend of the river below, smoke rising thin from a dozen chimneys, into a sky gone the color of a struck match. A blacksmith's forge still hammering somewhere past the general store in a rhythm that carried clear across the water. Children chased a loose hen across the muddy street, their laughter thin and bright, and a line of horses stood tied outside a saloon, with paint peeling off its false front, and for one breath it looked like any other frontier settlement, scraping a hard living out of hard country. Then Winona noticed how fast the shutters closed on the windows facing them as the wagon rolled past. She noticed the rancher outside the mercantile who kept his rifle in the crook of his arm even while he counted change for a sack of flour, his eyes never quite settling anywhere for long. Underneath the ordinary noise of a town at evening, something in Red Pine Crossing was holding its breath, and had been for longer than one bad afternoon could account for. Sheriff Thomas Grady met them in the street before Gideon had even set the brake, a lean man in his 50s with tired eyes and a badge that had seen better polish years ago. A man carrying himself the way men carry themselves when they have grown used to bad news arriving before good. He listened to the account of the ambush without much surprise showing on his face, only a kind of weary confirmation, as if he had been waiting for one more piece of trouble to land on his desk, and this one had simply arrived a little sooner than he'd expected. Virgil Cain, he explained, walking them both toward his office as he talked, had spent the better part of a year turning 70 miles of territory into his own private toll road. Stage lines rerouted around his stretch of country entirely, rather than risk the crossing. 2 ranches that had refused to pay him tribute had burned to their foundations within the same month, the families left with nothing but what they could carry. A witness who had once agreed to testify against him in the territorial court had vanished somewhere between his ranch and the courthouse, and had never been found, alive or otherwise, and nobody in town spoke of it above a whisper even now. Grady had 4 deputies and half a county to cover, and he said it plainly, without shame, because a man who has run out of easy answers has no use left for pretending he hasn't. Winona meant to rest one night in whatever bed the town could offer, and continue west at first light, still holding tight to the idea that the valley Charlie had left her was only 2 more days away, and that 2 more days of hard travel could somehow still be endured. The town doctor, a soft-spoken older woman named Ruth Calloway, who had delivered half the children in the valley over 30 years of practice, put an end to that plan within an hour of examining her. The strain of the trail, the ambush, the hard jolting ride through the canyon at speed, all of it together had put more pressure on the pregnancy than was safe to carry any farther without real rest, and Dr. Calloway said so with the flat, unshakable certainty of a woman who had seen what happened when travelers ignored exactly this kind of warning. Weeks, she said, not days. Winona needed a bed that did not move beneath her, food that did not have to be cooked, crouched over a trail fire, and time, more than anything else. Time for her body to settle back into carrying the child instead of merely surviving the act of getting him there. She had almost no money left to pay for any of it, and she said as much quietly in the small back room of the doctor's house, where she sat with her hands folded over her belly and her pride fighting a losing battle against exhaustion. Gideon had intended to be back on the mountain roads before sunrise, delivering the load still sitting untouched in his wagon bed to ranchers who were counting on it. But instead he walked down to the river that same evening while the light was still holding, and rented the small cabin standing empty beside the ford. And he paid the first month of it in full, using nearly every dollar he had earned that whole season, hauling freight through the passes. When Winona tried, 2 days later, to press what little money she had left into his hand across the cabin's narrow table, he simply closed her fingers back around the coins and shook his head, not unkindly. "The mountain already took enough from you," he told her, his voice low and certain. "I won't be the one taking more." It was by more than one account around town afterward the longest sentence anyone in Red Pine Crossing had heard him speak in a year, and word of it traveled through the settlement faster than either of them realized. The weeks that followed moved slower than either of them expected, unfolding in the small, unremarkable rhythms of a town settling back into its own routines, and somewhere inside that slowness, something quiet began to grow between them without either one naming it. Winona found work sewing and mending for families around town, her stitches neat and fast, learned at her mother's side long before Charlie or the trail or any of this, and in the evenings she taught 3 of the settlement's children their letters at the kitchen table of the little river cabin, patient with them in a way that made mothers stop in the doorway and watch a moment longer than they strictly needed to, drawn by something in the way she explained a stubborn letter twice without ever once losing patience with a child who couldn't yet make it stick. She grew stronger by the week, color returning to her face, the deep exhaustion of the trail slowly loosening its grip, though she still rested her hand low over her belly every time she stood from a chair too quickly. Gideon mended fence line for ranchers who had let their places go to seed during a year of living afraid, working from first light until the heat of the day forced him in, and he spent his evenings beside Sheriff Grady, walking the perimeter of the town on foot, marking the gaps in its defenses, the way a man studies a wound he intends to close before it festers further. He came by the river cabin most evenings on his way back up to whatever bunk he was using that season, never staying long, never quite explaining why he came at all, though everyone in Red Pine Crossing had their own quiet theory about it long before either Winona or Gideon admitted anything to themselves. They did not speak of loneliness, either one of them, not directly, not in so many words. But she watched him unhitch his team every evening with the same unhurried care he'd shown loading her trunk that first afternoon on the trail, the same attention paid to an animal's tired legs as to a stranger's grief, and he noticed the way she hummed old songs under her breath while she worked a needle through cloth in the fading light. Solo melodies in her own language that she never explained and he never asked her to translate, content simply to hear them. Some evenings he brought her wild plums gathered from a thicket above the river, setting the small basket on the porch rail without a word and riding on before she could properly thank him. Some evenings she left a plate warm on his side of the cabin porch before he even rode in for the night, covered with a cloth to keep the heat in, knowing near enough when to expect him that she had started listening for Cole's particular gait on the road. Neither of them called it anything. Both of them, in the quiet way people know such things long before they say them aloud, understood exactly what it was becoming. Some evenings, after the children had gone home from their lessons and the cabin had settled into its quiet hour before dark, Winona sat on the porch step and watched the river turn the color of copper in the last light, and she let herself think, for the first time since Charlie's death, about what a life might look like if it were allowed to be more than merely survived. She thought of her mother back at the agency and wondered what she would make of this quiet mountain man who paid a stranger's rent without asking anything in return and then found reasons, gentle and transparent as glass, to keep coming back. She thought her mother would understand it faster than she herself had, because her mother had always said that the measure of a man was not in what he promised, but in what he did when no one was there to see it and thank him for it. Gideon, for his part, found himself riding the long way back to his bunk more evenings than the terrain strictly required, telling himself each time that it was only to check the state of the river road, only to see that the cabin's chimney was drawing well. Only some small practical reason that grew thinner with every repetition until even he stopped bothering to believe it. He had spent 20 years building a life that needed nothing from anyone, and he found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he did not resent the slow unraveling of that particular kind of independence nearly as much as he might once have expected to. There was a boy Ranger had once known, and a wife whose name he had not spoken aloud in a decade, and some nights, walking the dark perimeter of the town with Grady's lantern swinging between them, Gideon let himself wonder whether a man was allowed to build a second life out of the wreckage of a first one, or whether the mountain simply gave a man peace and expected him to be satisfied with that alone. He had not yet decided the answer. He noticed, though, that the question itself had stopped feeling like a betrayal of anyone. One cool morning near the end of that first month, with frost still silvering the grass along the river at dawn, a respected Apache elder named Delche rode into Red Pine Crossing, leading 2 pack mules loaded with cured hides and bundled medicinal herbs for trade. A man old enough to have watched 3 decades of settlers move through this country, and shrewd enough to have survived every one of them without losing the steadiness in his gaze. He asked to speak with the sheriff privately, away from the general noise of the trading he'd come to conduct, and what he told Grady inside the small sheriff's office turned the color out of the lawman's face before he'd even finished speaking. Virgil Cain's gang, badly weakened by the loss of horses and supplies in the canyon collapse weeks earlier, had ridden south and made common cause with a band of cattle rustlers fleeing federal marshals out of the territory below, men with nothing left to lose and every reason to want a town's worth of stores before winter closed the passes for good. Together, Delche said, the 2 outfits now numbered near 28 riders, and they meant to take Red Pine Crossing whole before the first snow fell. Its livestock, its stored grain, its horses, everything a hard winter would otherwise deny men running from the law with empty saddlebags. Delche had no obligation to warn a town of settlers who had, in living memory, given his people little enough reason for trust. His own people traded peacefully along this river and had more reason than most to want Cain's violence ended before it spread any further into the hills where his family still lived and hunted, and he said as much to Grady, plainly without asking for thanks or payment for the warning. He stayed 3 extra days past his usual trading visit to help Gideon walk the ridgelines on foot, marking on a rough hide map the places where 28 riders coming hard would try to force their way in. And in the evenings he sat with Winona at the river cabin and spoke with her in a mixture of her language and his. Doc comparing the customs of her people to his own, and for the first time since Charlie's death, she felt something like the particular comfort of being understood without having to explain herself first. If stories like this one keep you watching, you can join the small group that helps decide which frontier tales we tell next. Tap Join beside the channel name, right under this video. Word of Delshay's warning moved through Red Pine Crossing like a fire catching dry grass, passed from porch to porch and store counter to store counter within a single afternoon, and for the first time since Winona had arrived she watched fear turn into something else entirely in the faces around her. Gideon organized the town the way he'd once organized a supply train through hostile country, methodically, without wasted motion, trusting every hand to do one job well, rather than everyone trying to do everything at once and accomplishing nothing. Ranchers and miners and the town's 2 blacksmiths formed patrol lines that rode the outer roads in rotating shifts around the clock, never leaving a stretch of road unwatched for more than an hour at a time. Hunters who could put a bullet through a running deer at 200 yards took up positions in the haylofts overlooking the main street, checking their rifles twice over in the days before the trouble came. Women who had spent the last year hiding behind locked doors now organized bandages, boiled water, and loaded spare cylinders of ammunition at long tables set up in the church hall. And the town's older children ran messages between lookout posts faster than any grown man could ride a horse through the crowded street. Fear had kept Red Pine Crossing small and divided for a year, every family looking only to its own survival. In the space of 4 days, it discovered something it hadn't felt in a long while, something Winona recognized from her own people's stories of hard winters survived together, the particular strength that comes from a whole town deciding all at once that it would rather stand together and fight than keep flinching alone. Winona, though the doctor had urged her to stay well back from any part of the preparations, spent those 4 days at the church hall regardless, her hands steady despite the weight she carried, showing the younger women how to pack a wound tight enough to stop bleeding, a skill her own mother had taught her long before any of this. She would not be simply hidden away while a town that had taken her in prepared to defend itself. Gideon, passing through the hall one evening to check the ammunition stores, watched her a long moment from the doorway before she noticed him, and something in his chest went tight and warm at once, watching her teach fear how to become useful instead of paralyzing. They came at midday under a hard blue sky without a cloud, to soften it, a wall of dust rising off the southern road, long before the riders themselves came fully into view, visible first as a smudge on the horizon that grew and grew until it resolved into shapes and then into men. When they did come, there were near 28 of them, exactly as Delshay had warned, spread wide across the flats below town, with rifles already drawn and drawn deliberately in the open, meant to be seen and to terrify before a single shot was ever fired. Church bells started ringing before the first crack of gunfire, an old signal the town had agreed on together in the days before, and within minutes every family that could reach shelter had reached it, doors barred, children pulled from the street into cellars and back rooms. Gideon had refused to make a stand in the open street, the way plain instinct might have told a lesser man to try. Instead, he'd spent 3 days positioning wagons crosswise at every entrance to town, forcing 28 riders down into 2 or 3 narrow lanes where their numbers meant far less than they believed they did. The fight that followed tore through Red Pine Crossing in a haze of gunsmoke and screaming horses. The ordinary sounds of the town replaced entirely by the crack of rifles and the splintering of wood. Hunters in the lofts, put careful shots into the legs of charging animals rather than the men riding them, unhorsing rider after rider, without the wholesale killing that Gideon had insisted from the very start of the planning they would avoid wherever the choice remained theirs to make. Blacksmiths rolled iron-banded barrels down the sloped street to block the lanes the wagons had left open, the barrels crashing and rolling with a sound like distant thunder, and old men too stiff in the joints to ride still knelt behind rain barrels loading spare rifles for younger hands to fire, refusing to be left out of the defense of a town that had become, in the end, worth defending. It was chaos, and it was loud, and it went on for what felt to everyone inside it like hours, though the whole of it lasted less than 30 minutes by the sheriff's own pocket watch, checked afterward with hands that would not quite stop shaking. Virgil Cain broke through the western barricade with 6 riders still behind him, his coat torn and his face streaked with dust and blood from a graze along his temple, and he did not turn toward the center of town where the fighting was thickest and the odds were worst for him. He turned instead toward the river, toward the little cabin where he had been told correctly, by some careless word passed between his men and a rustler with loose lips, that the pregnant widow from the mountain pass had been staying all these weeks. He believed, riding hard down that last stretch of muddy road with his horse lathered and blowing, that he had found himself an easy hostage, a way to turn the entire fight in his favor with one arm around one frightened, defenseless woman. What he found instead, reining his horse up hard in the cabin's front yard, was Winona standing in the open doorway, with a loaded rifle braced steady against her shoulder, despite the weight she carried, and 6 of the town's women, standing in a line beside her, every one of them armed, every one of them steady. None of them flinching at the sight of a bloodied outlaw bearing down on them. She did not run. 8 months carrying her child and with a killer bearing down on her at a gallop, she held her ground the way her grandmother had once told her the old warriors held ground, not because she wasn't afraid, her heart hammering hard enough that she could feel it in her throat, but because someone had to be the wall the fear broke against. And she had already decided a long time ago, somewhere in the ashes of everything the trail had cost her, that it would not be her fear that broke first. Cain never reached the doorway. Gideon came off the main street at a dead run the moment he saw which direction the outlaw had broken, cutting across the yard beside the town, just as Cain's horse skidded to a stop in front of the line of armed women, and he pulled the outlaw down off the saddle by the collar of his coat before a single shot passed between any of them. They went down together in the churned mud beside the well, and what followed was not a gunfight, but something older and uglier. 2 men trading blows with fists and elbows and whatever they could grab hold of, rolling through mud and splintered fence rail, kicking up dust that mixed with the gun smoke still drifting from the street beyond. Cain was younger and heavier and fighting like a cornered animal with nothing left to lose, throwing his whole weight into every blow. Gideon fought like a man who had spent 20 years learning patience the hard way, absorbing blow after blow to his ribs and jaw, without losing the calm that let him wait and wait and wait a moment longer for the one opening that mattered. That opening came when Cain, bleeding freely now from a split lip and half blind with fury, tried to draw a second revolver he'd kept hidden in his boot after losing his rifle in the fall from his horse. Sheriff Grady, running up the muddy slope with his own pistol already drawn, breath tearing in his chest from the run, saw the movement half a second before the hidden weapon cleared leather and fired once, precisely. The shot cracking flat and sharp over the yard and knocking the revolver spinning out of Cain's grip before it could ever be leveled at anyone. 2 deputies were on the outlaw before he could so much as reach for it again, wrestling his arms behind his back into iron while he cursed and thrashed in the mud, and within minutes the fight that had roared through Red Pine Crossing for half an hour simply stopped the way a storm stops. All at once and almost too suddenly for anyone standing in the wreckage of it to fully believe. Cain's remaining riders surrendered in 2s and 3s. Once word reached them down the line that their leader had been taken, most of them hungry, tired men who had followed him out of desperation rather than loyalty, and had little fight left in them once the choice was theirs alone to make in the dust and smoke of a fight already lost. By evening, the street that had run with gun smoke that afternoon was quiet again, littered with broken wagon rails and spent shells glinting faintly in the last light, and the town gathered slowly in the fading gold to count what it had lost, and what against every hard year behind them it had somehow managed to keep whole. The scars stayed visible for a long while after that day, burned fence posts still standing black against the grass, a bullet-scarred water trough outside the mercantile that nobody quite got around to replacing, the quiet way certain families still flinched at unexpected hoofbeats on the road for a season or two afterward. But something had shifted in Red Pine Crossing that no scar could take back or diminish. Neighbors who had barely nodded to each other across the street a month earlier now sat together on porches in the evening, the way people do once they've stood, shoulder to shoulder, against something that could have taken everything from all of them at once, and had come through it together instead. Several months later, on a bright, ordinary afternoon, with the river running high and fast from the spring melt, Winona gave birth to a healthy daughter in the little cabin by the ford with Dr. Bide, Calloway steady at her side through every hour of it, and Gideon pacing the narrow porch outside, unable to sit still, until the first thin cry finally carried through the open window and stopped him cold in his tracks, his hand pressed flat against the cabin wall, as though the sound itself needed bracing against. She named the child Nayeli, a name that carried the meaning of one who loves, and she chose it deliberately, wanting her daughter to grow up, knowing that her life had begun in a place where love, however quiet and however hard won, against fear, had turned out to be stronger in the end than anything the frontier had tried to put in its way. The land claim Charlie had left her, that river valley 2 days west that had seemed, on the worst afternoon of that mountain pass, like a promise the world might never let her keep, turned out to be richer ground than anyone had dared to expect when she first read his letter by lamplight, back before any of this had happened to her. Once Winona was strong enough to make the short journey to see it properly, Gideon rode out with her and little Nayeli both, and what they found was fertile soil running down to clear mountain water, grass tall enough to graze 100 head of cattle through a full season without strain, timber close enough to the river to raise a proper house and barn without hauling lumber 20 miles overland. He stayed to help her clear the first acres of it. Then he stayed to help her raise the fence line, post by post, through a long, hot summer. Then somewhere in the long, unhurried work of raising a barn frame together and planting a first season of crops in soil neither of them had touched before, staying simply became the shape of both their lives, a partnership neither of them ever needed to formally name, because the doing of it, day after ordinary day, said everything that needed saying. This channel keeps going because members choose to support it directly. If that's you, tap join beside the channel name and help keep these frontier stories coming. Years pass the way. Years do in country like that, measured less in dates than in seasons of planting and calving and the slow, steady growth of a barn that had once been only a burned-out foundation on an empty stretch of grass. The ranch Winona built on her late husband's claim, with Gideon's hands beside hers through every season of it, became one of the most respected spreads in that stretch of the territory, known up and down the valley for fair dealing and open gates, the kind of place a tired traveler could count on for a hot meal, and honest directions before pushing on through the pass toward wherever they were bound. Nayeli grew up chasing chickens across that same yard, the way children had once chased them through the muddy streets of Red Pine Crossing on the evening her mother first arrived there, half broken and afraid, riding in the back of a stranger's freight wagon with nothing left but a trunk and a letter and a stubborn refusal to give up on either. She grew up, too, hearing her mother's language spoken as easily around that kitchen table as any other, hearing the old songs hummed over needlework the way they always had been, and hearing, when she was old enough to ask, the story of the man who had stopped his wagon on a dangerous mountain trail rather than ride on past a stranger in trouble. She grew up watching Gideon and her mother work a hard season, side by side, without ever needing to raise their voices to each other, watching the particular ease of two people who had built trust the slow way through years of showing up rather than through any single grand gesture. And she carried that lesson forward into her own life, the way children always carry forward the truest things their parents never had to say aloud. Children in that valley growing up a generation later still love to hear the story of the afternoon. A mountain cowboy stopped his wagon for a struggling widow on a dangerous pass. They never remembered the exact number of riders who came down out of the hills that day, or how many dollars Virgil Cain had once stolen from stagecoaches and burned ranches before the sheriff's single shot ended it for good. What they remembered, what got passed down at supper tables and porch evenings for years afterward, was simpler than any of that, and stronger for its simplicity. A man who refused to ride past someone in need, and a woman who refused to let fear decide who she would become. By every hard rule of that country, have swallowed her whole and left nothing behind but another unmarked grave beside the trail. Long after the old wagon road through Eagle Ridge had faded beneath new grass and a rail line had made the mountain pass unnecessary for most travelers heading west, some still went out of their way to stop at a weathered wooden marker, overlooking the trail where it happened. Worn gray by decades of weather, but still legible if a traveler took the time to read it closely, it said nothing grand. It simply noted the place where a cowboy once stopped his wagon for a widow in trouble, on an afternoon when the whole mountain seemed determined to prove that kindness, whatever else the frontier took from the people who crossed it, was never really for sale and never really lost. Down in the valley below, where the evening light fell gold across a ranch house built from a burned foundation and a promise kept season after season, a family that had begun on the worst day of a woman's life went on quietly living the best of it, one ordinary evening at a time, the fences standing, the barn full, the child growing, and two people who had chosen each other slowly and completely, still working the same land, side by side, long after anyone in that country remembered to call it anything but home.